Thank you for coming. Welcome to the 6th annual Papa Theophanes lecture. My name is George Palantis, and I'm the director of the Wheaton Center for Early Christian Studies. And yes, the "va" is part of our title. I also teach from time to time in the theology department. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to our annual lecture. Before we do that, there are a few things. Let me talk a little bit about the center. Here at Wheaton, we have the Center for Early Christian Studies, in which we have undergraduate, first graduate, master's, and then doctoral programs in early Christian studies. We also have a number of our students, graduate and undergraduate here. One of our great joys is to have the certificate in early Christian studies. Judy, I'm looking at you. Yeah. Which is quite unique. Actually, it is the only such certificate in North America. If you're at all interested in patristic early Christian studies, the intersection of history, theology, development of doctrine, this is the place to be. And at the end of the year, we also have a good meal. So if you don't come to the certificate, come to the meal. What? Yes, we do. Yeah, this is an august occasion. We should not be making fun. It is our custom to open with prayer. So would you pray with me? The prayer comes from the evening prayer, from the Book of Common Prayer. A gracious light, pure brightness of the ever-living Father in heaven, O Jesus Christ, holy and blessed. Now, as we come to the setting of the sun and our eyes behold the vesper light, we sing your praises, O God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. You are worthy at all times to be praised by happy voices, O Son of God, O Giver of life, and to be glorified through all the world. Amen. It is my great honor and pleasure to introduce our speaker for this evening. Dr. Ayres is a lay Catholic theologian. He's professor of Catholic and Historical Theology at Durham University in the United Kingdom. And this year, he is Distinguished Fellow at Notre Dame's Institute for Advanced Study. He calls it sabbatical, but they asked him to work also for it. Dr. Ayres is an internationally known specialist in development of doctrine in the early church. He has written extensively, and many of you have used his Nicaea and its legacy, Augustine on the Trinity, the Cambridge History of Early Christian Literature, Augustine on Redemption, and many, many others. We are absolutely thrilled and honored to have you with us. Would you welcome him with me, Dr. Ayres?
How many people know where Nyssa is? How many people are here to make up points on midterm? Yay! Okay, right. We need to begin then. It's important we know where we are. George, thank you for that wonderful welcome. I'd like to begin my lecture this evening by thanking George and the Center for Early Christianity, the Center for Early Christianity, for inviting me here. Some of the most fruitful events of my career have been in the setting of an informal dialogue between Catholic and evangelical thinkers, and the fact that we come together over a common interest in early Christians is both a blessing for us and it offers a great deal of promise But before getting to my subject directly, I'd like to dedicate this evening's work, mine and yours, to a good friend who was only recently taken from us. Father Bill Harmless, who taught for many years at Spring Hill College in Mobile, and then most recently at Creighton University in Omaha, was known to all students in the field of early Christianity. He was known for his work on Augustine and on early asceticism in the East, but he was known, I think, especially to anyone who met him in person as a generous friend, mentor, interlocutor. It's only a week since Bill collapsed on his evening walk and suffered a massive heart attack. To all who knew him, this was a great shock because Bill was a frighteningly fit 61. I know he was frighteningly fit. I once tried to go running with him. We, of course, believe now that he is enjoying the greatest of all patristic colloquia unfolded in the life of God. But some of us still feel his loss very deeply, and I need to mention him this evening. So let's turn to Gregory of Nyssa. Gregory is one of the most important of those who in the late 4th century AD defended and articulated the Nicene faith. That faith which is foundational for virtually all Christian traditions today, whether or not they are formally creedal in belief. Gregory was not without his connections either. His older brother Basil, you may call him Basil, was one of the great voices of Nicene Christianity in the East, and Gregory himself was one of those appointed by the Emperor Theodosius after the Council of Constantinople in year 381 to serve as a guardian or definer of orthodoxy. His central work, the Contra Eunomium, was written, as the title reveals, against Eunomius of Cyzicus, one of the most philosophically sophisticated of those who opposed the Nicene Council during this period. Initially, drafts of his great polemical work were possibly read to an invited audience before the Council of Constantinople itself. And it's fascinating for those of us who study this period to speculate that in that room, that evening, could well have been Gregory himself, his family friend Gregory Nazianzen, Jerome, Diodore of Tarsus, the great Antiochene exegete, and a number of others. There probably was no other opportunity in the early church where so many of the great figures who would later be remembered for their theology were all together in the same place. It's only speculation, but it has a degree of plausibility to it. It is, however, not Gregory's polemical work that has made him the subject of so much modern interest. It is his supposed status as a mystical writer. Gregory's extended meditation on the life of Moses, for example, with its vision of the Christian ascending into the divine darkness and entering on an endless journey into the divine life, has captured many imaginations since the 19th century. From him, we have also a series of 15 homilies on the Song of Songs. These begin with a justly famous defense of allegorical reading, and they proceed to offer a dense and fascinating example of this practice, taking the audience on a tour of the Christian life as a journey into the life of God. Now, at this point, if my lecture had a score, there would be a screeching of brakes, or perhaps some form of dramatic musical pause, because one of my main goals this evening is to offer an alternative reading of Gregory's purpose in these homilies. I want to suggest that we need to be very careful not to separate the mystical from reflection on the life of the Christian community. In my text, I have begun to write mystical in scare quotes, and it is important that we consider the meaning of the term. But to avoid a long discussion of what might be meant by the term, and again, this will probably come up at question time, I will say for now that when I use the term mystical, I refer to that which is hidden, that which is granted Christians who grow in contemplation, that which is often hidden in plain view the hidden depths of our faith, our scripture, and our Christian life. So, let us turn to exploring Gregory's homilies as a vision of the church. In doing so, I hope we will learn a little bit more about Gregory himself, and we will find new questions about what it means to have a doctrine of the church in any age. But in order to talk about the church, I have to bring together two separate themes in Gregory's commentary. The first is Gregory's call for the Christian to know her own soul as reflecting the divine. The second theme concerns the church directly as a body wherein God is made visible. Now, one might think that these two themes are quite distinct in focus, but my aim is to show how deeply Gregory's distinctive account of the Christian's gaze on her own soul is actually only comprehensible when we place it in a broader ecclesiological context. The argument that I'm going to trace may be sketched as follows. I will argue first that when we look at Gregory against the background of previous discussions of self-knowing, we see a very distinctive emphasis. Gregory offers us a picture in which knowing oneself does not only involve knowing that one's logos or reason is that which is most truly one's own, but also knowing that the soul is more and more clearly recognized as the activity and performance of interrelated virtues grows within it. The more virtuous you are, the more you can know yourself. But, and here is the paradox, we know ourselves most fully, and we come to see the divine in the mirror of the soul, only as we recognize that our own virtues are also given to us. They are forms of activity in which the bridegroom, Christ, is also active. We know ourselves then when we see in the mirror of the soul, when we know that what is most our own is also being made clearer and more active through the action of God upon and within us. But at the same time, we grow in understanding of this dynamic of manifestation as we come to see that the bridegroom is bringing about patterns of manifestation within his body, the church. If we come to manifest the superabundance of the divine life, we do so for the purpose of knitting together the Christian community. And it is at this point that I think we see the distinctively ecclesiological and even episcopal, I'll explain what I mean by that later, character of these homilies. So our first task then is to think carefully about how Gregory envisions appropriate self-knowing. I could have begun by focusing on his use of the famous theme of the soul as a mirror in which one sees the divine. But I think it's important we look elsewhere to begin with. Now, even if Gregory had not seen self-knowledge as necessary for Christians, the Song of Songs itself pressed the topic on any Greek interpreter, simply because in the Septuagint version, verse 1:8 begins, "If you do not know yourself, O beautiful one among women." It doesn't begin like that in your modern translations. But for a second, let us step back from the song commentary and from Gregory to provide a little bit of background. One of Gregory's most famous reflections on self-knowing is to be found in the 6th of his homilies on the Beatitudes, a very famous text. And here he offers a very clear and striking vision of how we come to see the divine reflected in our purified soul. Quote, "The person who has purged his own heart of every tendency to passion perceives in his own beauty the reflection of the divine nature." The language of vision here is very direct. We clean the mirror and then we look into it. And it's no accident that this passage is often taken to be paradigmatic in expositions of Gregory's account of self-knowledge. My first suggestion today is that Gregory's account in the Homilies on the Song of Songs is far more complex than that found in this justly famous summary passage. Before we turn directly to Gregory's Homilies, though, let's take a few moments to sketch some aspects of the background against which Gregory's distinctiveness appeared. I'll do this by talking briefly about two of his forebears, Origen and Galen. Galen was a 2nd century medical writer, one of the most interesting writers of the 2nd century. We tend to think of doctors as not philosophers. Galen was both a doctor who engaged in groundbreaking experimental work, and he was a philosopher. His works are unfortunately not in modern edition. Few of them are in good translations, but he's hugely important for studying our period. We'll get some sense of why. In one of his most interesting works, which has the less than catchy title, The Diagnosis and Treatment of the Affections and Errors Peculiar to Each Person's Soul, he wasn't trying to sell in major airports. Galen devotes a significant section of his first book to reflecting on the famous Greek oracle's injunction, know thyself. Galen assumes that if we take this injunction in strict sense, self-knowledge is identical with knowing one's relationship with the passions. Are they allowed free rein, or are they under control? Now, when he uses the word passions or affections, he's referring to a long and venerable Greek pre-Christian discussion. Passions are most technically movements of the soul. They may come from outside the soul or from within it. Some of the most important passions we experience are anger and hunger. There are many others. The very first passion Galen himself treats is anger. While he says everyone should be able to tell that beating or biting one's servants shows that passion has overwhelmed them, it's fair. If you have any problems in that regard, beating or biting your servants, you need to attend carefully to Galen's message. If you do that, he says, you should know that passion has overwhelmed you. It is only those who are schooled to be reasonable or wise, the Greek term is phronimos, are able to discern the smaller movements of the soul that also betray when anger takes control. One of the other examples he gives, which cuts a bit too close to home, is when he talks about the person who throws their keys across a room because they're unable to use them on a door. I don't think he meant that. The history of reflection on the Greek oracles know thyself is rich and extremely dense. But Galen enables me to emphasize one point. Under the influence of what we term Middle Platonic and Stoic thought, early Christian writers of the Common Era frequently assume that self-knowing is about knowing the character of one's control over passions. It's discerning the soul's activity and life in the world. It involves both an internal aspect of self-knowledge. Am I able to read the signs of my own anger, my own hunger, and control them? Am I able to be attentive to how I perform externally those internal movements? Self-knowledge is about knowing one's passions. To get a little closer to Gregory, let's turn to Origen. Origen, of course, is one of the great writers of the early church, writing in Alexandria and then in Caesarea in the first half of the 3rd century. Origen spends a lot of time discussing the task of self-knowing in his own commentary on the Song of Songs, and he offers a definition that's partly parallel to our non-Christian author Galen. Quote, the soul ought to acquire self-knowledge of a twofold kind. She should know both what she is in herself and how she is moved. That is to say, she must know what she is like essentially and in her movements. Putting off for a while the question of the soul's substance or what she is, Origen immediately in this passage goes on to discuss the soul's knowledge of her movements, passions, affections, whatever English word we want to use. The soul has to know whether in both thought and action she attends to the cultivation of the virtues. The soul needs to know if she does evil intentionally or just through an inherent weakness. If we recognize that we sin through inherent weakness, Origen tells us, the soul can very easily become melancholy and angry and gloomy, and he's very concerned that that in itself leads to further sinning. Galen's account was resolutely practical and focused on the soul's ability to discern in its own patterns of likely action. Origen's additional emphasis on the soul knowing what it is, knowing for him that it is immaterial, it's not material, it's not extended in space, brings forward a theme found in many other reflections on the oracle's injunction to self-knowledge, something you find throughout non-Christian Platonists and Christian writers. It is, however, important to note that when Origen reflects on the soul's recognizing itself to be immortal, Origen emphasizes that this is important because only such a recognition will enable us to discern the ordering of the cosmos, providence, and appropriate judgment about relative goods. There's a practical orientation to self-knowledge that's vitally important for Origen as it was for Gregory. Gregory demonstrates a clear depth to Origen's reading. We know that he knew Origen's commentary, and we know that he knew Galen. But there is also a significant shift that it will take me a while to uncover. When in his second homily, remember there are 15, in the second homily, Gregory comes directly to Psalm 1:8, he immediately states the following: "Our greatest safeguard is not to be ignorant of ourselves, and not to suppose that we are looking at oneself, when in fact we are viewing something else." His focus then begins by encouraging the soul to distinguish its true nature from that which we associate with it. Unlike Origen, Gregory in this text is not particularly concerned with whether the soul is material or not, but with our tendency to associate ourselves with that which is only accidental or impermanent, taking the passions as themselves intrinsic to the soul. And in the paragraphs that follow, he makes frequent use of a distinction which he got from his brother Basil, between that which is our own, to idion in Greek, and that which is other, to alotrion. Gregory takes our first task to be distinguishing between that which is truly stable about ourselves, that which is modelled on what he calls the intelligible and immaterial divine nature. And this is our logos. But Gregory insists that this recognition is necessary if we are to judge accurately what is to be pursued, and if we are to judge accurately between good and evil. Gregory even ends this homily with arousing him to the one who seeks to know himself, envisaging such a person eventually looking down over the whole material creation and recognizing that only the human was created as an image of the divine. But it is here, precisely here, that we have to be very careful. We should not think that this passage contains all of the essentials of Gregory's account of self-knowing. I suggest that he thinks his readers will recognize that whenever in these homilies he takes up the question of the soul's attention to her activities, he is also taking up a discussion that he assumed was intrinsic to the discussion of self-knowing. If I'm right, then we find the topic of self-knowing discussed again and again through these homilies, but we find it discussed in a manner rather different from anything we encountered in writers like Galen and Origen before him. Gregory focuses his account on how the soul must learn to recognize not only that our own virtues are activities which mirror the divine, but that they are activities given by God. They are activities that are, in some sense, in the bridegroom's own activities. Allow me to comment on a few passages that reveal this dynamic. In his very first homily, Gregory exhorts us, quote, not to turn toward the flesh in our thoughts, but to look only to the soul, and to apply the language of love, pure and undefiled, to that good who transcends all understanding, that good whose enjoyment is the ever-available opportunity of yet nobler desiring, because by participation in good things, that enjoyment stretches and expands our longing. Now, if you found that quote incomprehensible, it's because Gregory's Greek is special, to say the least. Any attempt to translate it fails. I'll read the quotation again, because it's important to get this vision. He exhorts us not to turn toward the flesh in our thoughts, but to look only to the soul, and to apply the language of love, pure and undefiled, to that good, God, that transcends all understanding. That good, God, whose enjoyment, the enjoyment of which is, to enjoy God is, he says, the opportunity of yet nobler desiring. To enjoy God is always to have more God to enjoy. Because by participation in good things, that enjoyment stretches and expands our longing. If we enjoy God, the true good, God expands our longing. We stretch out and long for more God, and there is always more of God for us to reach towards and desire. In other words, Gregory tells us to focus on the soul and to learn that we must think of the ultimate good, God, as an object of love and desire. The more we love that true good, the more we enjoy goods, the more we are filled with his beauty, as he says a few sentences later, and the more capacity we have for further desiring. But where do the goods that we then have come from, and what are they? A little later in the same homily, Gregory likens the Christian soul to Moses himself. Quote, the bride, Moses, kissed the bridegroom in the same way as the virgin in the song, who says, let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth. And through face-to-face converse accorded him by God, Moses became more intensely desirous of such kisses. And just as now the soul that is joined to God is not filled by her enjoyment of him, so too the more abundantly she is filled with his beauty, the more vehemently her longings abound. Because the words of the bridegroom are spirit and life, and everyone who is joined to the Spirit becomes spirit, it follows that the virgin soul longs always to approach the fount of the spiritual life. This passage also gives you some sense of the sheer exegetical density and illusion that you find within these sermons. They're texts which were originally homilies. It would be interesting to know how the congregation found them. To read, they are difficult. A few sentences later, Gregory comments on the verse from the song, your breasts are better than wine, and the fragrance of your perfumed ointment is better than all spices. Now he fleshes out the same account, but in even less direct language. We'll see if we need to go through this twice. Quote, the soul that has been cleansed gazes upon the treasure house of good things. Now, the treasure house is called heart, and from it the breasts acquire their abundance of the divine milk, on which, according to the proportion of faith, the soul feeds as it draws in grace. Okay, the treasure house is called heart. From the heart, the breasts acquire their abundance of the divine milk, on which the soul feeds, drawing in grace. Somebody who conceives of the heart as the hidden and ineffable power of the Godhead would surely not be mistaken. And one may reasonably interpret the breasts as the benefits and activities of the divine power on our behalf. Through them, God suckles the life of each individual, bestowing the food that is appropriate to each of those who receive it. So the reference to the heart and the breasts is a reference to the power of God and the activities of God on our behalf. Through divine activity, God bestows on each of us a food that is appropriate to us. So the cleansed soul feeds on the breasts that are the activities of God. Now in this passage, Gregory spoke first about us seeing the treasure house, but then he subtly changes tack and he emphasizes that we draw from these breasts. We draw food. We see, but then we are nourished. If we see, it is because we are fed by divine activity toward us. So he begins with the language of seeing, he begins with the language of us separated from and looking toward God, and subtly he changes that until we are being fed by divine activity toward us, in us. A further step is taken when Gregory discusses the spices mentioned in the text from the song. The spices, if you remember, that are exceeded by the divine fragrance. He writes, quote, "The spices we should take to be the virtues, such as wisdom, temperance, justice, courage, prudence, and the like. And each individual assumes a different sense as he is dabbed with them in accord with his own power and choice." The virtues, then, are clearly given. They are that which the Christian, ascending toward God, draws from the divine breasts, the divine activity. Now, at this point, it's time to stop talking about breasts, and we need to note that there has been a long-running debate in scholarship on Gregory of Nyssa, particularly amongst German scholars, about how far our bishop can be said to be developing a synergistic account of humanity's cooperation with God in the process of sanctification. It's important to remember both the origins of this conflict and the complexity of the word synergy. The conflict originated in a German Lutheran debate, where some versions of the doctrine of the synergy of humanity with God was obviously enough considered simply heretical. Thus, to find such a doctrine in Gregory would raise considerable questions about his own usefulness in the present. Only Catholics, it might be thought, would find this attractive. And if you look back in some of the earlier literature in the 20th century about Gregory's anthropology within this German Lutheran context, it's quite striking how contemporary the discussion is. The accusations go back and forth. If you think Gregory assumes that human beings cooperate with God in the work of salvation, he's simply heretical. He's the sort of thing that only Catholics are interested in. And we were. However, we all have to be grateful to the work of Werner Jaeger and Eckhard Muhlenberg, two of the most important voices in this quite polemical debate, for opening up the conversation because of their vigorous argument about the different ways in which the very word synergy or cooperation can be understood. Jaeger in particular made a point that remains, I think, valid up to this day. He noted first that Clement of Alexandria, writing in the very early 3rd century, another writer known to Gregory, speaks a number of times about the cooperation, synergia, between God and humanity. But he seems always to assume that it is God who gives to human beings the ability and right of cooperating in the work that is accomplished. Moreover, Clement, he points out, clearly distinguishes this given cooperation from an act that co-causes man's sanctification. Gregory is technical and precise. God gives us the ability to cooperate, and yet there is only one who is the cause of our sanctification. Now for Jaeger, Gregory of Nyssa, on the other hand, writes much more directly of human beings, specifically the human choice, as working alongside the divine action, and he offers no real clarity about who may be said to be causing human sanctification. It seems, according to Jaeger, that Gregory, in fact, has an account which is susceptible of precisely the problems that good Lutherans should be concerned with. Now, so far, I think Jaeger was spot on, but then he goes astray. Because for Werner Jaeger, Gregory's enhanced view of the human contribution to sanctification was a consequence of an overvaluation of ascetic self-control that he took to have grown at the heart of Christian life since the 2nd century. Eckhart Muhlenberg, one of the other great Lutheran scholars of the 20th century, Lutheran patristic scholars of the 20th century, disagreed deeply with Jaeger and added some vital nuance. Gregory of Nyssa, he argues, actually assumes that the highest part of the human mind, where rational choice is located, is of its nature constantly illuminated by the Word. Grace is intrinsic to its existence. Thus, when through ascetic practice the desires or the passions are stilled, and the mind grows in its ability to choose God, this is not a purely natural human act cooperating with a distant and distinct divine act. It is an act of the grace-informed nature cooperating with the working of Son and Spirit in the Church. Synergy, then, has a number of different meanings. I want to add to this venerable discussion just one observation. In his commentary on the Song of Songs, in the passages that we have been considering, Gregory does not really make much, if anything, of a technical vocabulary. And I think we should resist assuming that we know what he is up to by importing terminology from elsewhere. We should attend a little more closely to the rhetoric of his homilies. And if we do so, we should notice, I think, that Gregory is intentionally pushing his audience and readers toward a constant recognition of God's work in the activities of the Christian life. It is certainly the case that we receive gifts in accordance with our own history of choosing and in accordance with our abilities. He says it over and over. And it is certainly that we are exhorted to struggle in our Christian lives. But Gregory's constant refrain in these homilies is that we grow in recognition that we receive, and that which are our gifts, those gifts which flower as a response to our struggle, must always be perceived as divine gift. He's encouraging an attitude to our lives as Christians. This rhetoric, I want to argue, throughout this paper, is actually at the very heart of that which Gregory is trying to get across to us, both with regard to our individual lives and with regard to the life of the Church. Do not allow yourself, then, to think that what I am describing is only rhetoric. And do not do so for two reasons. First, because there is no such thing as only rhetoric, especially in a Greek theologian of the early period. But, and second, there is another way in which I think we can trace Gregory offering something of a denser and theological foundation for this insistence that our virtues are also the Spirit acting among us. Gregory devotes considerable time to developing a parallel between the divine speech towards us and the gift of virtues, which I don't think previous scholarship has noted. And I think we see this most clearly in his third homily. In this homily, Gregory writes as follows, quote, "The divine nature transcends the mind's grasp. Our thought concerning it is a likeness or an image of what we see. Our thought sketches only darkly, in a mirror and in an enigma, a reflection of what we see, that somehow comes to birth in our souls on the basis of conjecture. All speech, however, that refers to such intuitions has the function of an invisible sign, unable to make clear what the mind intends. So far then, Gregory speaks about the task of thinking God and the inability of our concepts, let alone our speech, to reach to that which transcends. But then he suddenly changes direction. Quote, hence, Paul says that the soul is led by such intuitions to awareness of things that cannot be grasped. That soul must bring the nature that transcends all intellect within herself by faith alone. This is what the friends of the bridegroom say. We shall make for you, O soul, likenesses and manifestations of the truth. But you, when you have received these likenesses, shall become a dwelling place and a servant by faith of the one who reclines within you, dwelling within you. You shall be his throne, and you shall become his home. What this means is then shown in the case of Paul himself. Quote, he became the dwelling of the implacable nature, in that it was no longer he who lived, but he who shows Christ living in him, and gives proof of Christ speaking in him. There are two stages described here. The soul senses that God is, and commits herself to a life of faith. When she does so, the friends of the bridegroom, here they are the angels, elsewhere in the homilies, the Spirit, the friends lavish upon the soul gifts that enable a new awareness. Quote, when the bride has approached the object of her desire more closely, but before his beauty, Christ's beauty, is manifest to her eyes, she touches the one she seeks through her sense of smell. She says that she recognizes his, Christ's, fragrance by means of the sweetness of a perfume. For, she says, just as you confer not the pure gold of the Godhead, but by way of concepts comprehensible to us, likenesses of gold, and just as you do not disclose what pertains to it in clear speech, but you furnish intimations of the object of our search, by the tracings, only the tracings of rational speech, I too, in the fragrance of my perfume, sense the sweetness of the very one himself. Wow. What Gregory is saying here is that the soul that progresses in faith does not only form concepts of that which escapes her grasp, she also senses in her own perfume the scent of the divine. And this perfume is that which comes through the blending of the spices or virtues, as we saw earlier. So there is the soul learning something of God through concepts, and the soul learns something of God through her own perfume. And that perfume is the virtues. So just as we are addressed in speech, enabling us to know something of God, so we are addressed by receiving the virtues and seeing something, smelling something, allegorically, in that perfume. The rays of that truly divine virtue shine upon the purified life through the apatheia, passionlessness, that flows from these rays. These rays make the invisible visible for us, and the incomprehensible becomes comprehensible, because they portray the sun in the mirror that we are. We don't see them in the mirror. They portray the sun in the mirror that we are, by being with us. It is not just any virtue that interests Gregory, but the blending of virtues, which itself produces what he calls apatheia, which is not apathy in modern English, but passionlessness, the calm beyond the passions. The flowering and blending of virtues in the Christian soul creates a perfume that reveals something of the divine virtue to us. Now, Gregory parallels this process of our receiving virtues, being, as it were, addressed by virtues, with our reflection on the divine speech for a number of reasons. But one is because he sees us in both cases being addressed. We are addressed by God's speech, and we are addressed by God's gift of the virtues. Now, it is at this point that we can return to self-knowing. When Gregory talks directly about the importance of knowing oneself on the path toward the bridegroom in his second homily, His observations are preceded and followed by reflection on how one should view and interpret, not the passions, but the growing virtues within the soul. And it is here that we see a real distinction between Gregory and his forebears. The two earlier authors I considered, Christian and non-Christian, share a belief in the importance of attending to the activity of the soul, its ability to develop virtues, its ability to avoid being overwhelmed by passion. Gregory's approach is different, in part because when we know our own virtues, we know it for Gregory as gift. We know our own virtues as a form of divine speech to us. Origen himself already differs from Galen when he introduces the importance of humility. But there's little hint in Origen's surviving work on the song. There is little hint in Origen's surviving work on the song on the virtues as given, as a speech of God towards us. For Gregory, then, we know ourselves as we come to know ourselves as increasingly received from God, as increasingly living in the bridegroom, one might say. Now, the language of living in the bridegroom, of participating in Christ, will no doubt lead some to ask about the currently very popular concept of deification or theosis. This theme is somewhat tangential, but I'd like to add just a few remarks to help us put Gregory's language in context. Unlike Gregory Nazianzen, Gregory of Nyssa rarely uses the language of theosis, and he is even perhaps somewhat reticent about the various Greek terms covered by the English participation. I've argued elsewhere that this is so because of his deep commitment to reflection on God's distinction from the creature, a difference that for him enables God's intimate presence, and yet which frustrates any attempts we have to conceive of the relationship between creator and creation. One of the few ways in which Gregory is happy to proceed is to emphasize a theme drawn from a number of venerable Platonic traditions. He says a number of times that the soul participates in God through its mirroring of an activity. Love, for Gregory, most importantly, is a movement of the soul, and this in some way mirrors the activity of the divine life. The cause and the archetype of the soul's activity is present to the soul. The soul can be said, in that sense, to be in its ultimate cause, but we should know at every step that our language of space simply fails us. So, Gregory, in one sense, has a version of theosis. In another sense, he recoils at the language. You may want to come back to that. Striking though this personal theme is, this theme of being addressed by the divine virtues, I charge that we misunderstand it if we don't place it in a broader ecclesial context. And so, by way of coming to my second theme, the second theme I promised, I want to notice a feature of these homilies that's very easily missed. There is an arc, a direction, a plot to Gregory's exposition over the 15 homilies. He seems to begin with the individual soul and her ascent towards divine mystery. But we need to bear in mind not only that Gregory spends little time on the highest stages of that ascent, but also that homilies 13, 14 and 15 focus on Christ's body as the location for any ascent. Moreover, it is in these final homilies that we see in full a theme heard quietly throughout the whole. The bridegroom, Christ, adorns the members of his body with virtues, not for their own benefit, but as a means of manifestation to and for each other. Now, I made brief mention earlier in my paper of the idea that these homilies are not only ecclesiological, but also episcopal. What I mean by this latter term is evident if we reflect for a moment on the importance of the Apostle Paul here. Paul appears again and again throughout these homilies. He's almost the official interpreter of the Song of Songs. More accurately, he's the official interpreter of the vision of Christian life that the song should teach us. But Paul appears not as one who has ascended to the third heaven. He appears over and again as the one who has returned from his vision to lead and to teach. He appears as the model of the Christian leader, one whose leadership is based on recognizing that he has been given gifts for the community. While some scholars have assumed that the original homilies must have been given to an educated, small, ascetic community simply because they're difficult, I think the evidence for this, for them having been given in Nyssa itself, when he preached as a bishop before his flock, is much stronger. However much they have then been edited and rendered more complex. In them, I suggest, we should hear a bishop describing his own self-understanding, his own vision of the Christian leader in the church. But this vision of the Christian leader is surrounded by a vision of the church as a community of manifestation. The way of ascent has a strongly communal twist, rooted in Christ's drawing together of those who have been turned toward him. Have been turned toward him, no. The basic concern of the final homilies is actually announced clearly in homily number 8. Quote, if then the church is Christ's body, while Christ is the head of the body, forming the face of the church with the stamp of his own identity, maybe the reason why the friends of the bridegroom were heartened as they looked upon her was that in her they saw the invisible more clearly. However, rather than follow this line of thought all the way from homily 8, I'm going to focus on just a few passages from the last 3 homilies. First, in homily number 13, Gregory emphasizes that Christ shapes the church by ordering Christians in relationship to each other. Quote, he nourishes his body, the church, in the persons of those who are united to him in the fellowship of the mystery. And those members that are grafted into him through faith, he fits into the common body. He fashions a beautiful whole by fitly and appropriately assigning believers to roles as eyes and mouth and hands and the other limbs. And then a few sentences later, perhaps the most striking language in the whole series of homilies, anyone who focuses attention on the church is looking at Christ building himself up and augmenting himself by the addition of those who are saved. In fact, this fascinating homily blends together 3 different images. The individual Christian who seeks to look towards heaven and yet practice purity in the world. Second, Paul the Apostle, who teaches us how to look at the church and to envisage our roles toward each other. And third, Christ himself as the one who is both human and divine, displaying in himself and in his body that we can look upon and gain some sense of the divine nature. And in homily 14, this picture is deepened even further. Now here, Gregory comments on the strange language of Song of Songs, chapter 5, verse 13. I defy any of you to preach a sermon on this particular text. Quote, his jaws are like bowls of spices, pouring forth perfumes. The first bowl on whom Gregory comments is Paul the Apostle. Paul, he says, was a bowl able to provide food that was clear and perspicacious, suitable even for children. Why? Because the bowl that was Paul put off all earthly character at the time of his baptism. And he was then reconstituted of fragrant spice through the Spirit. So, to repeat, Paul the orator speaks because he has put aside his earthly character. Putting aside that character, he has received the spice of virtue given by the bridegroom. And hence Gregory can now interrelate manifestation through speech and manifestation through the gift of virtue. Paul, he writes, became a bowl for pouring out the wine of the word. He brought forth the divine drink within himself, and through the sweet savour of Christ he poured it out, like a perfumer, blending for his hearers the varied blossoms of the virtues. I'll read that again, simply because I like it. Paul became a bowl for pouring out the wine of the word. He brought forth the divine drink within himself, and through the sweet savour of Christ he poured it out, like a perfumer, blending for his hearers the varied blossoms of the virtues. In this passage, the analogy is reversed. Paul's speech is effective because it is like the perfumer blending a fragrance. And remember that fragrance here has the sense of that which results from the blending of virtues. And Gregory pushes a little further, almost immediately writing, therefore, the pure and the perfect eye, which makes of the jaw a bowl that pours and gushes perfumes out of itself, this eye blossoms with lilies in the form of words that proceed from the mouth of those who have been beautified by the divine radiance. In fact, Gregory is not really reversing an analogy between speech as manifestation and virtue as manifestation. He's exploring ways in which the two phenomena are simply interrelated. His interest seems to be in the virtuous Christian preacher and pastor who is used by Christ in the building up of his body. Such a one exhibits virtue to other Christians as a gift and thereby manifests God, and so draws together the members of the body. And naturally a new speech flows forth in the midst of the interpretive perfumer. We may fairly question Gregory's exuberance about Christian leaders and himself, but we should not fail to see that this picture offers a window onto an ecclesiological vision of the church as a body of divine manifestation, through which Christ manifests God and draws all together. Christ manifests not only through speech, but through the manner in which he himself blends his own perfume in the church, through giving gifts to each Christian. Indeed, we should see Gregory here as adding to his earlier emphasis on the individual receiving gifts according to his or her capacity. The individual also receives according to the role that Christ marks out for them in his body. Toward the very end of homily 14, Gregory writes, how blessed are the members through whose contributions the whole body becomes desire. By their perfection in every good thing, they produce a fascinating, enticing beauty blended out of all of them together. I've argued that there is a progress to these homilies, a narrative arc, and that this arc moves towards an ecclesiological conclusion. The comment could be misunderstood. I'm not suggesting that the assent of the individual is forgotten, absorbed by the collective. I'm suggesting that the assent of the individual is shown in ever sharper focus by placing her activity within the context of Christ's forming of his body. Homily 15 is a synthesis of all that is to be found in the earlier homilies. But I would like to point to just one striking passage. Gregory writes, the soul that contains the uncontained, so that God dwells within her, has been beautified by the one who dwells in her and becomes the heavenly Jerusalem, because she has taken the beauty of the heavenly Jerusalem to herself. The beauty and attractiveness of the king's city are, of course, only that of the king himself. The soul is the city, and yet the city's beauty is that of its king, Christ. In the same way, Gregory presents a vision of the individual Christian that finds its apogee in a portrait of the city, but that portrait of the city is always a manifestation of its Lord and King. Allow me to offer three brief conclusions. First, these homilies trace an arc of argument that first exhorts the individual Christian to see herself as manifesting the divine activity through her own virtues, which are a gift. In this sense, Gregory redescribes the very character of self-knowledge. not only as it is to be found in non-Christian writers, but also in his own Christian sources. He insists that we know ourselves most truly when we see our most noble actions as ours and yet as gifts, as a manifestation of the uncontainable. But second, Gregory pushes further and incorporates this vision of the individual into an ecclesiological sketch of Christ's body as constituted by mutually informing, manifesting activities of virtue. This vision is both very different from anything to be found in earlier commentators on the Song of Songs, and it is unexplored, I think, in existing scholarship on Gregory's view of the Church. My second conclusion, attention to this economy of manifestation forces on us some important questions about the nature and purpose of these homilies. As I have perhaps already indicated, I think there's a great danger in seeing them as examples of an individualistic mysticism of assent. It's not that they are not mystical, it depends what one means by the term. But the homilies exhibit throughout a deep concern with the church as a community and with the role of the Christian preacher. These are homilies used by Gregory to set out a vision of the church, not simply of the individual. And thus, my third conclusion. We've considered only one text from only one author, but I want to use this as a basis for a grander claim. Patristic Ecclesiology is at its heart and at its best a dimension of patristic Christology. By Christology, I mean a deep concern with the person and the work of Christ, with reflection on the work, the redemptive work of God in Christ. But I would push this even further and suggest a theme that I have not so far drawn out. I suspect that the more time we spend with Gregory, the more we have to see that Gregory's account of the church as Christ's self-manifestation in the world is deeply rooted in his Nicene theology. It is because he sees Word and Spirit as simply God, as one with the Father, as immediately and omnipotently present, as the reality of the divine life among us. It is because he sees these things that he can view the church as a mysterious and sacramental reality that directly draws us into the life of God. We see here something of what I might even want to call a Nicene doctrine of the church. And that is a good and solidly controversial point on which to end tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. We have time for questions. And I'm going to let you do it.
Sir.
Thank you very much. I found very attractive the notion that self-knowledge might consist in our ability to know our own passions.
Yeah.
And equally attractive Gregory's addition that it further consists in our ability to know our own virtues, and particularly know them as God-given. But it struck me that there was somewhat of a tension between those notions, given the way Gregory seemed to want to characterize virtue as a matter of passionlessness, and the idea that really we could only know ourselves when we had purged our hearts from the passions, as I think you put it in one passage that you read. So I'm wondering if I'm understanding Gregory on the virtues right, and why he held that view, if he did, given that so many virtues seem to be a matter of holding passions in moderation, feeling the right amount of something at the right times for the right reasons and so forth.
You are asking a perceptive and a difficult question to answer. Early Christian discourse about the passions is hugely important to them, and it has a long and complex philosophical background. Very simply put, for our purposes, one of the key philosophical questions is whether the passions are intrinsic to your soul or external to it. So for some writers, drawing on some aspect of Plato's work, although after much modulation in later tradition, there's a part of your soul which naturally gives rise to these movements, and it needs to be kept in check, because if you don't keep it in check, you will become unbalanced and start biting your servants. For other writers, these movements are not themselves part of the soul. They originate from other parts of the body, and the soul receives them, and the soul judges them. But the soul in itself is not there. Well, this leads to a number of interesting possibilities for Christian writers. When Christian writers think about things like anger, sexual desire, hunger, are these things part of the soul, or are they not part of the soul? Do we envisage the Christian being able simply to overcome them, not having them in heaven? How are they transformed? There's an interesting range of discussion. Gregory has a peculiarly sophisticated approach, or a peculiarly complex approach, depending on how generous you want to be towards them. And he does so in part because he wants to say, like most of his peers, that God is passionless. And yet at the same time, he wants to think of love as both a passion and as something which is above all true of God. So he has a concern in talking about God, not to fall into the trap of having an entirely passionless God. Rather, God must exhibit the perfection of all that is passion, even if some of the passions are not theirs. So often he'll find himself in quite tortuous sentences talking about the extirpation of the passions, although in some sense they're transformed. If you look at one of Gregory's most interesting works, on the soul and resurrection, which is really a dialogue with his sister Macrina. Gregory or Macrina, depending on who you think is speaking at any one moment, and it's a fascinating topic, both of them tend to agree in the end that the passions are in some sense part of the soul. They have to, otherwise Gregory couldn't maintain his account of God as loving. It's both philosophically and theologically necessary for him. And yet, for him, God's love is not a love that turns to anger. It's not a love that is blinding. It's not a love that we romantic moderns think that we want to see in ourselves, in which we fall in love with someone and do stupid things. For Gregory, that's not really love, because divine love must be a love that is not overcome. It's a love which is entirely rational. It's a love which never loses sight of the ultimate goal. It's never self-focused. So Gregory finds himself sort of caught here. The way in which you come to know yourself is through knowing your own activity as something which is able to control appropriately those passions that need control, and to allow the transformation and reshaping of that which in you, that passion within you, which is good. So he has a remarkably complex picture. I don't think that it's a tension in the sense of a fatal tension. It's just a Christianizing of speech about the passions that has remarkable complexity, but is never fully and finally worked out by him. That's an initial answer to what's a remarkably complex question. Yes?
In Gregory's work, which unfortunately I'm not that familiar with, what is the this may be another complex question, what is the relationship between virtues and passions? In other words, are virtues anti-passion? Are they the kind of positive or negative space against each other? Or are the virtues a controlling of passions? Or what is their...
That is another lovely question. And there is a good dissertation and a series of articles leading to a happy tenure file. Anyone who wants to take that question on. If you are the sort of Christian who thinks that the passions are in some sense intrinsic to the soul, it's very easy to get yourself into a situation in which the virtues are not unrelated to the passions in exactly the way you're suggesting. So for Gregory, the soul is something which is in motion. It is a form of activity. Love is an activity, just as anger is a bad activity that wells up, and we must appropriately use it and control it and govern it. So there is a deep parallel between the two, yes. That's probably all I want to say without getting into a very technical discussion. Yes, they do, in the end, come to mirror each other in some way, although not formally. Gregory doesn't yet have a fully technical language for that, but they are very close.
Much more explicitly Platonic and Stoic?
By the time you get to the late 4th century, Platonist, non-Christian Platonist writers use Stoic language all the time, but just transform it. It's almost impossible to distinguish clearly between those two, because those traditions have become so interwoven. So, for example, lots of Christian writers will say, Gregory as an example, will both have a picture of the soul that comes originally from a Stoic context, in which the soul is basically divided into two. There's a higher bit and a lower bit, and the higher bit is your sort of rational mind, in Greek called it hegemonikon, which is in charge, like hegemony. But he will also use Platonic language, straight out of Plato's Dialogue of Phaedrus, in which there's a sort of tripartite soul. He'll just use both. There's a melding of that language. There's a lot more work to be done on Gregory's psychology, without enjoying myself too much by going further to it. He's also, we don't have, and I think this is very important, with Gregory, as with so many early Christian writers, we don't have a fully worked out treatise in which he says, this is my psychology, this is my account of the human person. He clearly adapts his language depending on the polemical situation or the particular audience he's got in mind. And that's very, very common at the time, but it makes it quite difficult to answer some of these questions. You can see, as in response to both of your questions, you can see him having positions and coming up with a synthesis that really is quite different from some of his peers, but that doesn't mean that he has thought through all of the options and problems and questions. One of you three.
Somebody else. Why don't you go first?
Fight for it.
I'll go first then. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed some of the comments you made about how so much discussion about asceticism is so focused on the individual. We talked about the early church. It's very assumed that it's very solitary situation of moving in, the ascent being one person on a road.
Yeah.
So I really thank you for your emphasis on the community aspect of this. And so, and you didn't mention the term, you used the description of epictasis, the continual reaching and yearning into God forever. And I guess I just want to ask you an open, broad question. You can take whatever direction you feel you want here, of finding this communal movement into God, epictasis, is more of a communal idea, but also with his discussion on human finitude about what we can say about God, and how that movement forward, we can't necessarily verbally say what that's going to look like on an individual level or on a communal level. So what consequences, or maybe not consequences, but what significance might that have for a community of believers moving forward?
That's a simple question. Not quite sure where to begin with that question. It's such a good question. A number of observations, okay. First, and this is a more general theological response that I wondered if someone would have. Gregory finds it very easy to say, well, we as human beings just can't say very much about God. And someone out there is thinking to themselves, but surely through revelation this can be overcome. is this an analogy of being in which our created finitude somehow overcomes God's ability to speak? Gregory, were he here today, would say no. I don't think that that is the right response, because Gregory sees, of course, God as having created us and sees us as created in such a way that God can become manifest to us and in us. The fact that we can endlessly progress into God is part of the gift of what it is to be created for him. So I don't think he's setting this up as an infringement of divine freedom, although I see why people ask the question. The question, secondly, of how does this relate to sort of communal activity? In some ways it's difficult to know. I think that there is in Gregory in Ecclesiology, obviously that's part of my thesis. It's actually remarkably difficult to find in Gregory enough material to develop fully this sort of picture. You get some hints here. You get very little hint in Gregory's own works about how he sees, for instance, say, the liturgy as a communal enterprise, putting into sort of, sacramental manifestation God's activity in the world. There are some hints, and I presume he thinks like that. You find some of that in Basil, you find it in some of his other peers, but not that much in Gregory. But this vision of virtues, I think, is particularly interesting, because he's trying to get Christians to think about their activities within and beyond the Christian community. And he's not simply interested in how you as a Christian act well towards other people. He's not simply saying you must show virtue towards somebody else. That would be fine. But nor is he simply saying the community as a whole must work together. It's this theme of mutually informing manifestation that's peculiarly interesting, I think, and that really gives this density as an ecclesiology. The virtue that you gradually come to work through the gifts that you have been given is intended as a manifestation for the other members of the community. So he sees the notion of the church as Christ's body leading to a way of conceiving individual Christians as acting towards other Christians through their virtuous activity. And that seems to me quite significant, really. It provides a theological basis on which you can talk about the function of Christian works of mercy, because here, what we're talking about is part of God's economy of manifestation. It's not a secondary consequence. It's, so you believe in this, now you should go and do something. Rather, the gradual growth in you of virtuous activity is one of the ways in which God addresses humanity. And this analogy between being addressed by speech and being addressed by virtue, I think, is particularly sort of significant here. So somewhere in that, there's a sort of at least implied theology of the significance of Christian action within a community. But it's very difficult to draw out much further, because this theme, I think, is hinted at in one or two other works by Gregory, but not very much. And we don't have, unfortunately, from Gregory, a large corpus of sermons where you would ask yourself, how is this played out? We just don't have those, and so we can say very little. Some of this theme is to be found in Basil, but not quite in the same complexity as far as I can see.
I was wondering what you think we should take away precisely from Gregory's refusal to use some of the specialized categories of theosis, when he seems to be quite comfortable using categories of theosis, participation language, being convinced of the divine properties.
I think you have just allowed yourself to fall into a pit. In Gregory's immediate generation, there are not general categories of theosis. Okay. There is Gregory Nazianzen's extensive use of the word, there's a family, in a sort of Wittgensteinian sense, a family of ways of talking about being in God, in which the use of the mere preposition, I think, is hugely significant, although difficult to interpret. So, to say that there are these categories, and then Gregory uses some of them, I think is a problematic way of thinking about it. Rather, what we have to think about is, how does Gregory talk about this common theme of being in God? What does he do with those passages? And I think what you see there is, as I sort of hinted at the end, and had we another half an hour, I'd want to develop this. You see something which I think is sort of the outworking of Nicene theology. One way in which you see this particularly clearly is in developments in pneumatology. So up until the 4th century, when people talk about the Spirit, they actually have very well developed theology of the Spirit. But the Spirit has what I think of as a very well-defined set of functions that the Spirit performs. The Spirit sustains you in your Christian life, brings you messages, keeps you going. Earlier on, the Spirit is also involved in creation, but in the 3rd, early 4th century, much less so. That only comes back in the late 4th century. So you have a set of traditional roles for the Spirit, but those change once you want to say the Spirit is simply God. The Spirit is one with Father and Son. Suddenly, the Spirit's messages, or the strength that the Spirit gives you, is the divine life. It's not an extra, it's not a thing, an intermediate reality. The Spirit is, perhaps, to put it clearly, so distinct suddenly from an angel. You can't use angelic language to describe the Spirit. The Spirit is the presence of God. And so what you find, I think, because of that theological development, is theologians of all sorts of different kinds and traditions beginning to talk about Christian life as an incorporation into Christ or into the divine life in all sorts of ways. And those people who talk about the Spirit transforming us and using the language of theosis in the way that Gregory Nazianzen does, are doing something that's quite similar to Augustine talking about our love as the presence of the Spirit. They're all making use of a theme in which the Spirit is the immediacy of God's presence. In Gregory of Nyssa, he's very wary about these sort of languages which seem to blur the distinction between God and Creator. And he's interestingly sensitive to the idea that because God is so distinct from the world, God can, almost in a sort of Augustinian way, be closer to us than we are to ourselves. And so he talks about us existing in God on a number of occasions, but he doesn't want to use one of these languages about the transformation of us into God. He's very worried about the mistakes we might fall into. So he's operating, if you like, within the family that Gregory of Nazianzen's theosis language finds itself. It's a family very much dependent on the development of Trinitarian theology. So, there's somebody had a hand over there on this. Yeah.
If I understood you correctly, you noted that he uses both male and female imagery to refer to both Christ and God.
Yeah.
And would I assume then that referring to the individual believer or the church, he would then correspondingly use the opposite gender in that relationship? It raises the question of whether there's any consistency in how he draws allegorically on the song, or does he, in a sense, kind of pick and choose, in a sense, to make his theological points?
He is every bit as consistent as the song. He swaps between male and female pronouns or sentence constructions depending on the scriptural text that he's using. He seems largely uninterested in whether this has any great significance, as he says in Against Eunomius. It's for him only the fool thinks that God actually has a past or a future or a gender. He just doesn't understand. He almost always talks about the Christian as a he, except where the language of the song demands something different. But then he addresses the soul then mostly as female. But he seems to me utterly uninterested in the sort of gender reference questions that we would be interested in that. He's simply determined, I think, by the scriptural language.
individually from God to the individual believer in the church, and then the virtues are communicated from believer to believer. And I'm wondering how he would talk about those virtues being communicated, like from God to the individual believer, like through sacraments, through like prayer, through preaching, like all of those. If you could talk about that a little bit.
Okay, again, that's a very good question. Well, like a lot of early Christian writers, Gregory is reticent to talk directly about the character of the liturgical performance and baptism. He alludes a number of times quite clearly to baptism. So, one way in which the virtues are given to you is because you receive the spirit of baptism. He alludes to that a number of points. But he assumes, I think, a very complex process of receiving gifts as an individual, in that he talks very strongly about sort of divine action at many points, especially when he's talking about God giving you virtues because of the role that God has accorded for you within the body. That is very much divine action. At the same time, there is a perfection which must go on, you must strive. And there is, in a loose sense, a synergistic process that he seems to hint at, in which the more you struggle, the more virtue you receive, which enables you to struggle and so forth, and you're in that sort of cyclical process. The one thing that I'd be careful about in the way you phrased the question was the idea that then there's a consequent giving of virtues from you to other Christians. At that point, what he's talking about is manifestation. The virtues are given to the soul, the virtues inhere in the soul, and that depends on your relationship to Christ. It's the same Christ, the same Spirit, who gives virtues to both of us. What we give each other is better understood, I think, as a manifestation towards each other. In the same way as we might manifest God through speech to each other. You know, you might be raised up by God within the body of Christ as a preacher, and you give words. The faith which comes is, however, still the individual's and God's. So, something like that. It is difficult to parse these things out, because I think, as I tried to make clear in the middle of my lecture, I think Gregory is quite intentionally blurring all of those categories so that you, as an individual, focus on the way in which what you take to be your own is given. And an appropriate response follows from that. The rhetoric is the theology in these homilies.
Would you join me in thanking Dr. Ayres for his It is truly a humbling experience for us to remember that ecclesiology is a manifestation and expression of ultimate Christology, and not the other way around. This lecture and our program has been made possible through the generous donation support of Dr. Franklin Julie Papatheopanis, whose name we honor in this lecture, and then subsequently the generous support of many supporters who helped the center. With their support, in March 19th and 20th, Ayres and many others, and Dr. Levering, and who's here, we'll be back here, not here, but in more appropriate places, because this is a science building, we have no place here. To talk about divine simplicity, very often or simplicity as a foundational doctrine of God. So mark the calendars, March 19th and 20th. On the evening of the 19th, we're also going to have a public lecture by Father John Burr, the Dean and Provost of St. Vladimir Theological Seminary. Thank you for coming.